Okay, we are live. Great, just seeing people joining. Hi. Okay. All right, I'm going to get started then. So hello and welcome everyone. My name is Isabel Kent, and today I am so delighted to be speaking to Alayo Akinkugbe. This is part of a series of live interviews organised with the Kolnagi Foundation, where I talk to artists and creatives whose work looks to the old masters and the history of art and reinterprets it for our modern age. And I'm so thrilled to be talking to Alayo. She is a final year student studying history of art at the University of Cambridge. And just 1 year ago, Alayo set up an Instagram account, A Black History of Art, to highlight the overlooked narratives of Black artists, sitters, and creatives throughout history. And she posts on a huge range of different narratives and stories, from her first post of being this early 19th century portrait of Madeleine, which was formerly for a very long time known as Portrait of a Negress, to contemporary artists such as Kehinde Wiley, Faith Ringgold, and also lesser known up-and-coming artists. And I really love following Alayo's account. I'm constantly learning and being introduced to new people, including Babajide Olatunji, who we interviewed as part of this very same series back in the autumn. Okay, so since founding her account, Alayo has collaborated with the NPG, with Art UK, and recently with Gucci. And so all this while still doing a full-time degree. So I'm really excited to be talking to Alayo about her work so far, about the place of Black narratives in the history of art, and about how we can approach these sort of diverse and nuanced stories in the future as we continue to write the history of art. So, without further ado, I'm going to add Alayo to the live. Let's see. All right, connecting. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for joining. And yeah, it's really great to see you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. So where in the world are you at the moment?
I'm in uni right now. I'm at Keys, in my uni room. Yeah, just sort of looking forward to the weekend.
Yeah, yeah. Been a long week. I'm sure you're in the middle of the chaos of third year. It's
Chaos of third year is exactly how to put it.
Well, I really appreciate you sort of finding the time to do this interview. Yeah, I'm so excited to be talking about your. Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. I think for some reason the sound was just cutting out there, but
Hopefully it'll be fine.
it will be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so I sort of wanted to start off just asking about this account, kind of what was the impetus behind starting your account?
So the driving force behind starting the account, and this is what I always say, is kind of my frustration at the lack of Black representation on my degree. And I keep thinking back repeatedly, like over the past year of having this account, to first year, and I'm not sure that I actually covered a single Black artist on the whole of first year here. And yeah, so I think it was the frustration at not studying any Black artists on my degree, and just kind of as a mean. I also created the account as a means to self-educate. So because obviously when I started it out, I had no idea how much of an audience it would garner. So it was kind of more for myself, and I had this idea of like leaving Cambridge, having not studied any like Black artists, or having studied very few. But I mean, I should also note that at the time when I started it, I was doing the contemporary art paper, and we covered some African American artists and some Black British artists, and I found that so interesting. And that's when it kind of dawned on me that this, like, the whole Black narrative in art history had been left out in my first year. So those are the kind of like things that were going through my head, and those are the things that kind of drove me to start
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of hearing how things have changed, you know, that some courses are including it. So I did the same course as you know. I mean, we
Yeah,
know each other outside of the interview.
yeah,
For those who are watching who don't know, I did the undergrad at Cambridge, but a few years ago now. And yeah, there was absolutely nothing, you know, this sort
yeah.
of barren landscape of lack of diversity.
And it's changed even whilst I've been here, like in the
Yeah,
past. It's like rapidly changing, which is great to see.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'm
yeah.
going to talk to you a little bit later. I want to ask about the kind of diversifying art history and the different movements that are happening around that in the education system.
Hmm.
I want to talk a little bit about your account first and kind of thinking. Well, I mean, it's really, as you say, it's really exploded over the past year and been received in this huge way, which I think, you know, I saw your account quite early on, and I think I immediately knew that it would be this huge thing. But has it been like a surprise to you? Has it been kind of, what's it been like, the whole experience?
Yeah, it's been a huge surprise because honestly, like because of the nature of art history degrees and the way art history is taught in schools and universities, I just thought that like Black narratives weren't included because they felt like either it wasn't relevant or that people weren't interested in it. Um, and so I could never have seen this happening. I could never I didn't expect so many people to have an interest in what I saw as niche, but actually is not niche at all. Like I thought, okay, I'm interested in this because I'm Black and I'm studying art history and I don't see presented. But I don't think that, I think that actually the audience, I mean, my audience is completely diverse. It's not just sort of Black art history students. And I can see now that so many people have like an interest in this. And I think it's kind of sad that because of the way it had been taught to me, I felt as though it was this sort of like niche little area of research that I was just going to put some things on Instagram and no one would really care. So I think it's kind of showed the urgency as well for diversifying art history curriculums. And I also like I was thinking earlier today about how a few people had sent me messages, especially like at the time when it was blowing up, saying that they hadn't studied any Black art at school or they hadn't studied any Black artists on their degrees, which were either like 30 years ago or like 3 years ago.
Mm.
And it just kind of, I don't know, I guess the sudden like the sudden growth and the huge audience kind of made me realize how important it is to be talking about this and how relevant it is, because I thought it was relevant initially. I thought it was just me who was interested. So yeah.
It's yeah, I mean, so much of what you say could pick up on, but it's just interesting you saying that you thought that it was niche because I can imagine, you know, I mean, one of the things that immediately when you start to explore your account, or you know, when I was exploring your account, is you realize just the crazy amount of diversity and this hugely different narratives
Yeah.
and different stories and everything, and it's you know, it's as complex and diverse as anything is, right? You know, the different narratives from around the world. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested that you kind of mentally thought that it was niche before kind of embarking on this journey.
Yeah, because I think I thought it was niche because I was doing this like, okay, so I'll take the sit as an example because in my first year we had the first year dissertation and we had to pick an object in Cambridge to write about, as you 5,000 word essay. And I chose a drawing in the Fitzwilliam Museum that was of a Black sitter, and it was Fanny Eaton. And it was a pre-Raphaelite drawing, and to me this was so like fascinating. But because I couldn't really gauge the interest of my peers. I couldn't see whether this was that people thought would be interesting. And no one else was really kind of focusing on a sitter rather than an artist or anything like that. I wasn't even sure that that was possible until I was doing it, and no one seemed to object. And sorry, I'm veering off. But
Great.
yeah, I guess that's kind of what made me feel like it was niche. I couldn't see very much of that happening around. But then I remember my first year dissertation supervisor pointed me to Denise Morel's Posing Modernity, which is an exhibition that happened in New York and also at the Musée d'Orsay. And she did an exhibition just kind of tracing the existence and like, identifying Black sitters in European art. So it was called Posing Modernity from Manet and Matisse to Today. And yeah, that really kind of showed me that like, oh, this is a whole thing that people are doing. They're like looking at sitters and trying to identify Black sitters. And yeah, it was just interesting to me, but it still felt very niche because it wasn't at all something that we were looking at on the degree. But obviously now I see that there's a lot of interest. It's not niche at all. Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting the focusing in on sitters, because this is kind of going away from, I mean, going to get all art history here, going away from the Bizarre, and it's all about the artist biography. And something that your account does that I think is really wonderful is highlighting the sitters. Like, you seem to have done that from the very beginning. And I want to know, what are you finding from that approach? Like, looking at the sitters, looking at these kind of overlooked narratives.
Yeah. I mean, I think the sitters thing, kind of, the reason I decided to include sitters on the account was because we had a lecture about feminist art. It was in approaches, so that's like all about theory, and we were talking about how some feminist art historians think it's really important to identify female sitters, so that they're not kind of like erased from history, and that they're seen as part of the art, and they're important, as important as the male artist who's painting them. And so obviously my mind immediately went to, what about black sitters? Because we looked at Manet's Olympia, and we're talking about the model who was lying on the bed, who ironically I've forgotten her name, but and we didn't kind of address the maid in the background in terms of her identity. We only talked about her, and then there's also the maid, and some black artists have reinterpreted this painting and foregrounded the maid, but we didn't talk about the fact that we're not talking about who the maid is. I was like, I could just take this idea that's apparently limited to feminist art history and, put my own spin on it and try and identify some of the black sitters. And that's exactly what Denise Morel was doing in that exhibition, which is why it was important to me.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how, we've had the sort of the wave of feminist art history, and yet they weren't addressing, they were saying, with your example, saying, okay, we need to address the sitter here, and yet it was the that was the only one who was important to address.
Yeah.
And it's sort of exciting, but it's also depressing, I suppose, that the black focus is only just kind of getting to that stage, I suppose, with this exhibition and with this reassessment. Like, it's really important, but it's a shame.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk? Sorry.
And then that just, to me, again, emphasizes the need for like art history curriculums to diversify, and for there to be a range of people sitting in the room, because if not, no one would kind of have these alternative ideas like, what about this? But sorry, what were you gonna ask?
Yeah, no, I was gonna backtrack a little bit and just ask a little bit about your kind of inroad to, and your sort of experience getting to study history of art, and where did your sort of interest in art come from?
I think
just seeing how it's
I think initially it at school I did art GCSE, but I'm not an artist. But we were lucky enough to have art history offered as an A-level, and that was where my interest and kind of knowledge of art history initially came from. And the thing that kind of really sparked it was doing the articulation competition, which is a student competition where you speak about a work of art for 10 minutes, which you do in like sixth form when you're 16, 17. And I did it on the first painting that I posted on this page, which was Portrait of Madeline, which at the time there wasn't a name for the model. It was just called Portrait of a Negress. And obviously also back then I didn't think it was a thing to talk about sitters, so I kind of alluded to like the socio-political context of representing a enslaved woman, and how she may have had no control over how she was presented because she's presented semi-nude and things like that. But I didn't kind of dive deeper or think about the sitter. But I would say that is where that point was, when my interest, like deep interest in art history, really kind of, that was the spark, that was the thing.
Yeah. We've sort of talked about this outside of this interview, of how, looking back, I mean, the fact that was your first kind of big art history thing, and it seems to sort of weave in with what you're doing now. It's interesting how these sort of threads continue through. So talking about the account, I mean, these sets of interviews, as you know, are all about like connecting old masters and contemporary, and I wondered if there are any of the contemporary artists that you're really excited about and featuring that you think sort of fit into this.
So definitely Kehinde, who I have featured on my page, but it's I featured his portrait of Obama because he did the presidential portrait of Obama, which was so radically different to all the ones that came before. But his actual style takes very, very direct influence and inspiration from old masters and kind of supplants the white male figures often with black male figures and kind of ignites or synthesizes kind of contemporary portraiture and traditional Western European kind of portraiture. So I think if we're going to talk about old masters, he's one of the people who I feel is really, really kind of, you can see the clear connection between his work, which is so contemporary, but draws so heavily on old masters.
Yeah. I mean, he's someone who is clearly kind of using the old masters and adapting it in quite a sort of political and statement way, as in from the his African American context, and the done that are just extraordinary. On this point, I mean, so one thing I was wondering is this idea of the opposition, I suppose, between the kind of that a black artist has to be working in opposition to the white canon or in response to this sort of predominantly white Western canon. What do you think of that, and how do you think of that?
I think that I don't think it's right to say essentially that black artists should work in opposition to the canon. I think that one of the reasons why Kehinde Wiley is so successful and so well known is because he kind of adapts it or subverts it. And I think it's really interesting when these things are being subverted, because black artists are obviously aware of the canon, of the European canon of art, the Western canon of art, whatever you want to call it. And I think, I don't think they necessarily have to work in opposition to the canon. I also don't think that necessarily artists in general, not just black artists, should be trying to kind of canonize their work or anything, because something we've spoken about on the degree, we had a whole essay about this last year, was whether the canon, the existence of a canon can even is even useful, because an actual canon doesn't exist. Like, we just have certain works that we might say are in the canon. But yeah, I hope that somewhat answers the question. I'm veering off.
Yeah. No, sorry. I think it was quite a broad question, but I think this idea that the canon doesn't exist, something that your account does so wonderfully, is sort of is just explore that. I mean, I think we all inherently are aware of the fact the canon doesn't exist. It's still taught in schools. It's still kind of the first book most people read about art history is Gombrich, A Story of Art. The story of art. The classic canon. And yet what we're finding, and what I think you are sort of spearheading with your Instagram, is the idea of a sort of diverse set of parallel stories that all exist and interconnect.
Yeah.
I don't know, sort of doing that consciously, or if it's just...
No, it definitely is a conscious decision, and something I'm thinking about as well is not all art history curriculums are sort of totally devoid of black art, but often the black art that we're taught is again rooted in Western societies or in the UK and in the US. On the contemporary art I did, it was firmly rooted in America and in England in the kind of 80s. But it's also really important to have this kind of, for me, to have this global approach to art and to art history, and also being a Nigerian, growing up in Nigeria, but then being educated here, it just, I think that there's a lot of importance in recognizing sort of the different narratives that exist everywhere in the world at once, if that makes sense. So not just saying, I mean, you can't just say what, I couldn't possibly say what a black history of art is. It doesn't really exist as one singular narrative, if that makes any sense. But I think it's really important to be aware of what's being created all over the world, because there are black people all over the world, and so for me, having that global approach is kind of imperative.
It's really interesting what you're saying about the global approach and these interconnected stories, because I think even when you look at sort of quote unquote global art history, it seems to stem from Europe anyway. The way that it's written, the sort of global art history, that means colonialism, but that is obviously stemming from the root is Europe. it's not actually treating these other sort of centers as centers. They are always periphery.
Yeah, exactly. And last year, as part of the kind of diversification or decolonization or anti-colonization of the approaches course, which is the theory that we do in second year, we studied Alayo Akinkugbe, who talks about this idea of multiple centers existing at once, but also the idea of sort of dismissing the idea of a center because the idea of not countering a center, because to counter a center is to acknowledge its existence, or to say that yes, the center of art history or the center of modernity is in Europe. Does that make sense? And I just thought that was really interesting. That's how I kind of have my global approach, and like trying not to think of like everything from the European perspective, even when I'm talking about art from other parts of the world, not sort of always comparing it to something that I've noticed that happens in Western art. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that comes across. It feels as though, reading your posts and talking to you about stuff, is you treat each individual as an individual who exists, within their context, as opposed to always sort of relating it to,
traditional art history or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, which is really refreshing, but also reading it just feels natural. Like it doesn't feel like it's some sort of big political statement, because it's not. It's just natural to, I suppose, treat everyone as different,
as existing kind of in its own right, not necessarily being part of a narrative or story.
I mean, someone I wanted to ask you a bit about is the person you're doing your dissertation on. We had chat about that, and this is sort of an example of a non-centered narrative, I suppose. So could you talk about her a bit? Belka Sion.
Yeah, Belka Sion. Yeah. So Belka Sion was a Afro-Cuban artist who was kind of mainly active in the 1990s, and she made a series. Well, not a series. Her whole body of work is kind of collaborations, which are like a kind of hybrid between collage and printing, and they're all they're monochrome. They're all black and white, and they respond to Abakwa, which is an all-male Afro-Cuban society that kind of was adapted in Cuba from Epe, which was an all-male secret society in South Nigeria and moved to Cuba with the transatlantic slave trade. So her prints, she's the first kind of person to respond to Abakwa with illustrations, and her prints really focus on the female character, kind of is in the foundational myth called Sikan, and she is persecuted because she steals the wisdom of the Abakwa god. And so there was just so much to kind of unpack with her work, and I've never seen her work in person, and I'm only kind of aware of a couple of exhibitions of her work that happened in the past kind of 10 years in America. But there was just a lot to unpack there, so that's why I chose to write about her.
It's interesting hearing what you were just saying about the religion coming over with the slave trade, across the Atlantic, and then developing there, and what we were talking about narratives and transition. I mean, that is that could be a different way, rather than again, sort of going back to this, sort of relating it to the West or whatever, rather than it being a relation to sort of white culture, classically, it's a relation back to this kind of homeland African sort of religion, Nigerian religion. And I wonder, at a discourse that you're finding, this kind of these parallel, again, this idea of parallel narrative.
Yes, I'm very interested in that idea of the parallel, and thinking about kind of how, I don't know, like the African American narrative is clearly different. African American narratives of blackness and experiences of blackness are different to my experience as a West African person living in the UK. And I'm interested in the parallels, but also in kind of recognizing those differences, and just absolutely getting away from this idea of a singular blackness, and this idea that blackness is this one thing that we can just pin down and say what it is, because everyone's experience is different, not just based on geographical location, but because of a range of other things. And yeah, so I'm interested in the parallels, but also crucially in making every single kind of person's experience kind of, I want to communicate the individual artist's experience in my post, rather than just say, this person is representing this, this is about the Black experience, which I don't even think exists, because everyone has a different experience of it.
Good. Yes, exactly. I agree with that, of course, and that was very eloquently put. And so on this topic, how then can it be sort of taught? I know you're really involved at Cambridge with this sort of decolonized movement and with various sort of pushes to get the education system to be better and to explore these stories better. I mean, how do you go about doing that when these are so many diverse, stories?
So should I talk a bit about decolonize and the kinds of things that have been happening? So
that for people who maybe don't know.
So there's a decolonized history of art and architecture at Cambridge, and it was started in 2017. So probably while you were here.
I
yeah.
remember.
Yeah, and so it kind of, the initial push in 2017 was for a diversification and decolonization of the curriculum and the reading lists, and asking for kind of a broader range of authors from a broad range of countries to be included on our reading lists, and also, I guess, kind of moving away from the idea of a Eurocentric history of art being. And in my time, that letter has had like such great effect. So in my first year, we had kind of still the very traditional canonical idea of progressing from ancient Greece to like Damien Hirst, but in my second year, which is the theory and the approaches course, there was the course had been totally rejigged, so it wasn't kind of just looking at the German philosophers. We did still look at Hegel and Kant and everyone you'd expect, but the second term was really, really kind of rooted in the contemporary discussions around art, and I think that was definitely initiated or triggered by the first decolonized letter. And since then, we've kind of been trying to work out what the aim is with decolonize, whether it's to have a more kind of global, to push the department to create a more global curriculum, or to have more kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial theory included on our courses. And it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what it is we want to do, because it's multifaceted and different people have different ideas of what decolonizing art looks like. But yeah, that's kind of what's been going on, a whole range of things. And we've also had like events, kind of like a panel discussion last term on art of the African diaspora, which the aim of which was to kind of just provide a kind of parallel but also counter narrative to everything that we were being taught in our degree. Or just provide something that we knew that we wouldn't get in our degree. So just like almost like an alternative learning experience, which I think is also kind of interesting, and I hope that after I'm gone, that's something that keeps happening. But yeah.
I mean, I suppose that all sounds really great, and again, we've talked about this before, the difference between sort of my experience of doing undergrad, which was only 4 years ago, so not a huge amount of time, and yet it feels like it's changed. The course has changed so much, which is just fantastic. Also, the problem, I suppose, with art history departments, as opposed to larger subjects like history and English literature and things, is, there are only half a dozen professors in the department. And so, to make, there's only, and those professors only have sort of specific specialisms, whereas in, history you can have, I don't know,
loads.
I don't know how many professors the history department has, 30 or something. 100, but it allows for just more scope, and I think that it's great that with sort of, I suppose, lectures and things like that happening outside of the department, getting new speakers in, and also the approaches course changing is just really great. Do you know how other places? I know you've mentioned Yale as that they're sort of changing things up a lot. I want talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I wrote it down because I wanted to be sure of what I was saying. But they changed their survey course, which I think. Well, I don't really know how their degree works, but they changed the survey course, which was called Introduction to Art History, and it was going from like the Renaissance to now. And I'm just going to quote Tim Barringer, who I think is the director of the History of Art department at Yale. And he said, "I want all Yale students to have access to and to feel confident analyzing and enjoying the core works of the Western tradition. But I don't mistake a history of European painting for the history of all art in all places." So yeah, I mean, I just thought that it's good that they're moving away from the survey course and kind of saying this is the introduction to art history. It begins in the Renaissance, ends at whatever you want it to end at. They're kind of taking a more global approach, and he was asking students to write essays arguing for certain artworks to be included on the course. And I guess that's almost kind of like arguing for certain artworks to be included on the canon, I think is how he puts it. But yeah, I just think that that's a really good model to kind of have this more global approach, and just moving away from this survey thing, because I think the survey is really good at tricking the students into thinking they sort of know a narrative of art, or they know how art has developed, or how art has progressed, like kind of Hegelian, Asarian idea. Which I think just kind of needs to be moved away from, because it tells only one story. I'm not saying it doesn't have any merit whatsoever, and I enjoy studying history of art, and I enjoyed studying this narrative, but it's really, really important to be aware of the other things and to not think that this is kind of like the whole of history of art. So that's why I like their model, and the fact that they're trying to take a more global approach and do it more thematically rather than kind of chronologically, which is kind of impossible.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds great, and it's just making me think of the fact, we all sort of, there's the human nature of like craving stories, craving a narrative, but what
Yeah.
we need to do is find that narrative in something that isn't a sort of a linear progression, this false narrative. Maybe that will come in the form of sort of thematic stories that go across
Yeah.
times and objects and across different societies. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, or if there are narratives come across that really you think really work well.
Yeah, just to give you an anecdote, this term I'm doing a Chinese art course, and it kind of is a survey course of Chinese art. So then again, I'm not getting like the full story of all of Chinese art, but it's the best that we can do for an 8-week term. And we were looking at some kind of Buddhist art in the Mogao caves. And my friend was like, "Oh, I wish that I had learned about these frescoes, which was so much earlier than Giotto when I was studying the Giotto course." And it's like that kind of thing, like making those kinds of parallels is really important. I mean, I didn't do the Giotto course, but I feel like if I had been kind of firmly rooted in the Western narrative of art history, then I would kind of see frescoes as maybe beginning with, I remember a slight allusion first year alluding to like sort of cave paintings as being the first frescoes, but then really talking about the real stuff, which is what happens in the Renaissance, Italy. And I think that having a global approach then kind of gives you a clearer narrative, like that incorporates all the things that we think are important in art history, which is like material and style and everything. And I just think that, yeah, I just thought that when my friend made that point, I was just like, this is why the curriculum needs to diversify. This is why we need to have all these different stories being told rather than just the Renaissance to now narrative. And even the Chinese courses, as a result of the push from Decolonize, because it didn't exist before last year on the Cambridge course. So yeah, that was another ramble.
No, it's amazing, and I think it makes me reflect on also the potential of museums to be able to do this in a way that I think maybe sort of courses or survey courses and things like that, there's a difficulty there, but in a museum, I just remember from a personal perspective, the first time I ever went to the Met in New York was when I was 13, and I'd sort of been dreaming about going to the Met, and I remember walking from the sort of classical antiquity sculpture room just through the way into the African wing, and being bolder, it just feeling like, oh, this is all this, this is all fantastic, this is all equal, and you can't walk around and see this art and think one society is better than another. It's all about just this this extraordinary potential of human creativity, I suppose. So yeah, I think museums maybe have an advantage there to be able to do that. And I wondered, if there are some, what you think about that, and how you have been noticing curation maybe taking a stronger lead in these sorts of discourses.
I mean, I feel,
or is curation a bit behind? I don't know.
This is a tough one. When I go to museums like the Met, I've been to the Met once, and it kind of felt very similar to the British Museum and to the Fitzwilliam Museum here in Cambridge and to all the other museums I've been to in Western Europe. And I feel like they all do a very, very similar thing, and that they're all sort of telling the same story. And I remember the first time I went to the Fitzwilliam Museum here, I was like, oh, they've got their sarcophagus in the basement, and then they've got their sort of impressionists on the top floor, and then they've got their I don't actually know if they have any sort of African objects, but I feel like there is a danger in the way that museums currently are of kind of sticking with this linear narrative. And I feel that from my experience of visiting museums, I get sort of the same idea over and over again. Like they all have these parallel collections of,
idea, trying to get the world in microcosm, and start the precedent of ancient Greece. I mean, even in my anecdote, that there is a big wing of ancient Greek sculpture and Roman sculpture. So
exactly, yeah. So yeah, I hope that kind of.
I think that's totally right, and maybe I wonder if how museums will change their hang. I mean, I know that you're thinking about going down a curatorial route, and if that were to happen, what would your sort of vision for a museum be? I say there's such a big question. I'm sorry. You don't need to stick to this, but just some ideas, I suppose.
I mean, for me, the kinds of curating that, I mean, I'm very much interested in curating contemporary art. I think that's where my own personal passion and interest lies. But museum curating, I can't really see myself working in museums, so it's quite hard to say. But the reason that exhibitions like Denise Morel's Posing Modernity are so kind of inspiring to me are because they look at history and they just kind of totally reframe it. Like she totally shifted the narrative of kind of from impressionism to now, just by sort of through her theme, with what's it called? Olympia, with Manet's Olympia, she renamed the painting just Laura, which is the name of the maid. And I just thought that is so powerful to me. And so, yeah, I think that's why sort of curating, that wasn't a contemporary exhibition, but the kind of curating that reframes narratives really, really interests me, because it's we've been told this story, everyone knows this story of this is how the 19th century worked. Here's this other, I'm just going to look at it through this lens. And to me, that's what's really interesting. And it would be interesting to think about how my sort of idea of an ideal museum, what it would look like, but I've never thought about it before.
Yeah, I mean, this exhibition sounds fantastic, and I think that ability for exhibitions to sort of reframe in such a major way. And I mean, what you said about titles is interesting too, because of course most art pre-20th century doesn't have a title. It wasn't sort of titled by the artist, but we impose titles onto them, and so those sort of have been different. I mean, the very fact the portrait of Madeleine,
has been renamed.
Correct. How would approaches have differed to that painting over the course of art history if it had been given a different name?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's a question, but yeah.
It's just
yeah, because I was having a conversation recently about that with someone who wasn't as clued up on kind of art history, and they were really, really surprised to learn that a lot of names are put onto paintings, and the artist doesn't always give the work of art a title. So because of that, that means that like so much of the way we look at art is malleable. I just thought that was a really I mean, I hadn't thought deeply about it before, but yeah, her doing the renaming of the titles was just, in my mind, like genius. I was like, yeah, like,
Yeah.
change.
I look into this exhibition. I wish I'd seen it.
Yeah, I didn't either. I just have the catalogue, which I refer to it a lot for posts about sitters on the page.
Yeah. No, really fascinating. I think we're coming to the end of our time. I've just had a look at the time; it's flown by. But I just want to ask, sort of, what's coming up for you? What's coming up in the future? I mean, you've done so much already in this 1 year that you've had this Instagram account, and I wondered, what are you excited about next?
I think, I mean, at the moment the plans are, I've sort of been trying to get my podcast going, and I say podcast because I don't have a title or anything, and I've only recorded a few episodes, but that is going to be centered on conversations with contemporary artists, not super famous, not super well known or anything, just artists that I'm interested in, and probably also archivists and people doing kind of a similar thing to what I'm doing on Instagram. I want it to be as global as possible, and I don't know, I guess just kind of continuing, just keeping the page going. At the moment, I have like not very much time to think about where I want to take things, obviously because of the degree. But yeah, just.
I was going to say, you definitely can't be blamed. I think you're juggling so much with a third-year Cambridge degree, which I just remember my third year was almost a write-off. It was so
literally.
So yeah.
Just kind of on autopilot at the moment, but yeah.
No, it's really exciting, and all of these conversations that we've been having, I know that they're only going to sort of grow and expand as you continue to do your work, and also as the the public become more knowledgeable about these stories too. It's really exciting to see how how museums will change, how academia is already changing, and I can't wait to see where you go.
Thank you. It was great to see.
Yeah, it was really great to chat, Alayo, and and good luck with your dissertation, good luck with third year, and thank you everyone for watching this discussion. So
thanks.
Yeah, go follow Alayo's account if you don't already, follow the Kolnagi Foundation if you don't already, and oh sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, I was just saying follow Izzy, follow Kolnagi as well. Follow everyone.
Great. Yeah. Right. Thanks so much, and thank you everyone so much for watching. All right. Bye, guys.